I've been thinking about vulnerability. Why do we or don't we choose to be vulnerable? What kind of work does being vulnerable do? In what circumstances am I willing or not willing to be vulnerable? I think, in part, the question of vulnerability is connected to patriarchies and the way they govern what is and is not sayable. I think things get labeled as touchy-feely as a way of regulating discourse. I think what is emotional is considered secondary to what is rational, which has its roots in the hegemony of Western intellectual traditions that are imperialist. So this got me thinking about a particular way of thinking that might be helpful to make sense of what has played out in our class with regard to the culture as a costume exercise and what is likely to play out again in the future. Here is the framework for thinking that I'd like to use. Naming it. Owning it. Sitting with it, but not wallowing in it. Bringing it back to grace. Here is what I mean by that, naming it. Our group's interpretation of the costume picture was in part grounded in whiteness and educated classness. Owning it. My whiteness had something to do with our interpretation, that we might have convinced ourselves to question whether or not the person in the picture was donning blackface. My classness had something to do with our interpretation, the way we seemed to miss the bigger point because we got bogged down in the details of textual analysis. That was my positionality surfacing, which is deeply rooted historically and spatially. Sitting with it, but not wallowing in it. One thing I've noticed is that, to make a generalization, white folks, or rather anyone who is a recipient of privilege, can get tripped up by their guilt and realization of complicity with institutionalized racism or oppression. While I realize this is part of the learning process, I also think this can be counterproductive. I think it can recenter whiteness unintentionally, which doesn't seem to be the impact that anti-oppression discourses are aiming for. Bringing it back to grace. To demonstrate what I mean by this, I will turn to a letter written by Ruth Zimmer and Rachel David, two people who I respect immensely and who have an interest in fostering collaboration, but know that collaboration isn't easy. Here is the letter. As we all know, this campus has had a tough year. We're all struggling with issues of climate and morale. The two of us feel there is something missing from many of our interactions around this struggle. In our conversations with each other, we have come to refer to this missing element as grace. Here is our working definition of grace. When we know we are right, and someone else is wrong, grace involves allowing the other person to have dignity. When they mess up, we cut them some slack. Having grace requires that in someone's worst moment, we don't crucify them. We point out their error with compassion. We recognize that next time, it could be us making the mistake. Grace means that, while we don't always agree or even like each other, we treat each other as professionals. We try to see each other's perspectives. We say hello when we pass in the hallways. Grace means taking people where they are. We are all in a process of growth and learning. People do change, but usually change is slow. We often continue to treat people in a certain way based on our initial judgments of them. Grace means checking our perceptions and assumptions about each other. Grace includes forgiveness. Forgiveness does not mean forgetting, sweeping things under the carpet, or letting people off the hook where they are accountable. It doesn't mean losing a backbone and not critiquing each other. Forgiveness is a communicative process. It's not something I do to you, it's something I do with you. It involves talking to each other, looking at each other, being real with each other. Grace involves finding ways to forgive that honor the feelings of both parties. Grace also involves accepting criticism with humility, dignity, and forgiveness. It means we listen when it's difficult to listen. We apologize when we hurt others, whether we meant to or not. And we change our behavior when we realize we are causing hurt. In our conversations, we have come to realize how difficult it is to have grace. What do we need to have grace with each other, especially in the tough times? Basically, we need to receive grace in order to give grace. That's what we think. What do you think? What is your role in creating more grace? And who will start? So, I guess that is where I want to close. That perhaps we as a group should be thinking about how white supremacist capitalist patriarchy is performed in our own microcosmic experiences as a cohort. How it regulates space. How it regulates who talks and who doesn't talk. How it regulates what is and is not said. And ultimately, how it regulates the way we interact with each other when we are at the edges of our comfort zones, learning together in a space that should not always be comfortable, but should always be safe and grounded in principles of trust and grace. Thanks for listening. Now let's get started.